197 BC. At Cynocephali, in modern Greece, Philip V of Macedon leads 26,000 men against an upstart state from the Italian peninsula. The day of the battle is foggy and the battlefield uneven. At the heart of the Macedonian army is the square of pikemen, the phalanx, just as in Alexander's day, 130 years before. The Romans used smaller, more mobile units. The 14-foot spears of the Macedonian pikemen, though deadly, meant they could only go in one direction, forward. As the two armies closed at Cynocephali, the huge, tightly packed Macedonian phalanx struggled to maneuver in the fog and on the bumpy ground.
The Roman army was not a phalanx army. It was a massed formation army, but one in which the members of the massed formations fought, as it were, individual duels against the enemy.
The Macedonian left flank crumbled. Seeing this, a Roman officer took 3,000 men and attacked them from behind.
They were not, like men in a phalanx, all shoving together with their spears to create pressure against those on the other side. They were singling out an individual enemy and coming to hand blows with him, which is an extremely dangerous way of making a living.
The Romans exploited gaps in the phalanx. Once inside, they slashed and thrust with their short swords.
You didn't have much sense of mercy for those who were running away. You pursued them and slaughtered them until they were done for.
8,000 Macedonians were killed, 5,000 taken prisoner. Cynocephali was the turning point for the upstarts from Rome. Only 4 years earlier, they'd acquired Spain, their first possession outside Italy. Now they controlled Greece. They stood on the brink of empire. Rome was the first big state to emerge from Europe. It gained its empire by making war. War was the central activity of the state. Between the 2nd century BC and the 2nd century AD, in the space of 400 years, Rome became the most powerful and influential force in the Western world. For 1,500 years, the West took the symbols of imperial Rome and imposed them on banks, universities, and government buildings. Roman architecture set a seal of authority on public buildings, just as the Roman language, Latin, lent power to medicine, learning, and the law. But the greatest legacy Rome left the West was its army. This was the instrument of Roman state power. The Roman army wasn't afraid to steal the best ideas from those they fought. The spear of the Greek phalanx was adapted into a throwing spear, the pilum. It was designed to penetrate the body, then bend or snap so it could never be hurled back. Rather than marching into battle, spear in hand, the Roman army hurled their pila to break up an enemy formation. This flying phalanx kept the Roman soldier out of killing range. Freed from the weight of the spear, foot soldiers could now carry a deep rectangular shield or scutum. But they stole their best weapon from Spain, the short, double-edged thrusting sword, the gladius hispaniensis, or Spanish sword. Just as lethal as the Greek spear, the Spanish sword was easier to handle in close combat. Finally, the Romans broke up the phalanx into smaller, more maneuverable units called manipulus, from the Latin word meaning handful. The Romans forged an army that could fight on any terrain and that could pursue and beat any foe. The Roman historian Polybius said,
"The Roman legionary is adaptable to any place, at any time, for any purpose."
Rome's new weapons and tactics brought her success after success. But with success came problems. The expanding empire stretched Rome's frontiers. Rome built wooden forts, stone castles, walls, and earthworks to defend her new boundaries. But these had to be manned. Rome needed more soldiers. Rome recruited her soldiers only among property-owning citizens. But these men had farms to work and families to support. They couldn't afford to be away from home all year long. By 200 BC, with a population of 3.75 million, 750,000 Roman citizens were soldiers. 20 years after winning at Cynocephali, Rome needed more soldiers to serve in Greece. The Senate decreed the consul might at his discretion enroll veteran centurions and soldiers up to 50 years of age. No exemption should be given to anyone under 51. One of these veterans was Spurius Ligustinus, who had fought at Cynocephali.
I served 2 years in the ranks in the army, which was taken across to Macedonia. I was promoted to centurion for my bravery. After the defeat of the Macedonians, I left immediately for Spain as a volunteer.
For 20 years, Spurius served all over the empire, from Greece to Spain to Asia.
4 times in the course of a few years, I held the rank of senior centurion. 34 times, I was rewarded for bravery by the generals.
But Spurius's family and land had suffered during his extended absences. He wasn't a wealthy man.
My father left me half an acre of land and a little hut in which I was born and bred, and I am still living there today. As soon as I came of age, my father gave me his brother's daughter to wife, who brought nothing with her save her free birth and her chastity.
Rome could not rely forever on the goodwill of men like Spurius. If the empire was to expand, the old system of recruitment would have to go. But as Rome struggled with the problems of expansion, on the other side of the world, in the Far East, another empire was emerging. Between 230 and 221 BC, one man would bring a patchwork of warring and hostile states together under his control. His name was Qin Huangdi. His empire came to bear his name, China. They were so far apart, yet China and Rome were so alike. Both were vast. Both had strong governments. They assimilated the peoples they conquered and brought centuries of peace to the heartlands of their empires. They ruled similar numbers of people and similar expanses of land. They strengthened their empires with roads, defensive walls, and sophisticated waterworks. In China, the Grand Canal stretched 1,200 miles, linking Beijing in the north to the Yangtze River in the south.
First great difference between them was that the central institution of the Roman Empire was the army, whereas the central institution of the Chinese Empire was the civil service. Another very interesting difference between them is the way in which they dealt with incursion, invasion. The Romans did so by attempting to destroy those who entered the Roman Empire with hostile intent, whereas the Chinese dealt with invaders by turning them into Chinese, Sinicizing them as it's called, and they were remarkably successful at that with wave after wave of conquerors throughout their 5,000 years of history.
This is the army of the Emperor Qin Huangdi. These terracotta warriors were made to protect his nearby burial site. More than 8,000 of these slightly larger than life-size figures have been uncovered near Xi'an in modern China. They leave us in no doubt of the Imperial Army's power and its diversity of forces. Cavalrymen with their horses, infantry, bowmen, charioteers, and crossbowmen, proof the Chinese had crossbows over 1,000 years before the Europeans. Qin boasted that he ruled all under heaven. In the 3rd century BC, through brute force, he molded China into a single state. The Qin Emperor and his successors introduced a universal draft. Every Chinese man had to complete a month's military training each year. The 8,000 figures of the Terracotta Army represent the millions of men under arms in the Imperial Army. A world away, the Romans solved the problem of controlling their expanding empire in the same way the Chinese did, with a professional army. The army she built was the basis of her power for 700 years and is still the model for armies today.
appetite. Don't leave me here high and dry. Oh, well, I don't wanna jinx it, baby, and twist myself at the spine. Don't wanna overthink it, baby. It's just twist your body and mine.
War were brought from conquered lands to fight as gladiators. The Roman general Gaius Marius used them to train his troops.
No general before Gaius Marius had done this, but he summoned the masters of the gladiators and introduced to our legions a more accurate way of parrying and inflicting blows. He consequently produced a combination of courage and skill in such a way that the one reinforced the other, with courage supplementing skill with all its zeal, and skill teaching courage how to safeguard itself.
Marius took the Roman army, already a fearsome fighting machine, and turned it into the most organized, disciplined, and ferocious force the world had seen. But Marius changed more than training. He understood the importance of symbols. His most visible legacy to Rome's armies was the legionary standard with its imperial eagle, a symbol of power and pride and a rallying point in battle.
In battle, you want to know where the leader is. That, I think, is the origin of the eagle, which was carried close to where the commander was. But then it ramified. The honor of carrying the standard became very great. The ignominy of losing your standard, your eagle standard, became equally great. In many ways, it was all very practical. Of course, the eagle has come down to us as a symbol of military prowess, but that's an accretion. It's not the original purpose. But nevertheless, eagle symbolism became symbolic of Napoleon's armies, and they took curiosity of the American armies too, and the armies of the Third Reich as well.
Hitler's Third Reich was the last European empire to be won by force of arms. To give his police state a veneer of legitimacy in the democratic age, Hitler borrowed heavily from Rome. His troops marched under standards copied from those of Rome. The straight-arm Nazi salute was Roman. 2,000 years after Marius commanded his Roman army, its symbols lived on in Nazi Germany. At the heart of Marius's reform was training. Almost 500 years after Marius's death, Vegetius wrote a war manual called Epitome of Military Science. He said Roman military success was due solely to the military training begun under Marius. The Gauls might have been more numerous, the Germans taller, the Spaniards stronger, and the Africans more treacherous. Vegetius even conceded the Greeks were more intelligent. But, he writes,
what succeeded against all of them was careful selection of recruits, instructions in the rules of war, toughening in daily exercises and strict punishment of cowardice. No one is afraid to do what he is confident of having learnt well. A small force which is highly trained in the conflicts of war is more apt to victory. The raw and untrained horde is always exposed to danger.
Roman soldiers trained so often and so hard that they were nicknamed Marius's mules. Every day they practiced with their swords, learning to strike not with the edge, but with the point.
A cut, whatever the force, seldom kills, because the vitals are protected by both armor and bones, but a stab driven 2 inches in is fatal.
Every night, no matter how far they marched, the army had to build a fortified camp. Every soldier's backpack included a shovel. It was both for defense and attack, as by digging the soldier could secure his own position and undermine enemy positions when laying siege. 500 years after Marius, Vegetius could still say with confidence,
Victory was granted not by mere numbers and innate courage, but by skill and training. We see that the Roman people owed the conquest of the world to no other cause than military training, discipline in their camps, and practice in warfare.
But training alone wasn't enough. To solve the manpower shortage, Marius allowed men who didn't own land to join the army. This new breed of warrior, with no income but army pay, became the career soldier of the Roman army.
De homunculus orabilis consecute rectus. Hey!
The only allegiance he owed was to the army. The Romans made the army an attractive career choice for young men. It offered regular pay, fringe benefits, and an opportunity to advance socially and professionally.
On the whole, the Romans did succeed in paying the army on a regular basis, from the rise of the regular army right to the collapse of the system at the beginning of the 5th century. I think that was the most attractive of all the inducements. There were fringe benefits, as we call them today, healthcare, the chance of making a career for your children too, marrying your daughters to other soldiers, putting your sons into the army.
When Roman soldiers retired, the state continued to care for them. A piece of farmland was the usual reward for service. These Chelsea pensioners at the Royal Military Hospital in London are cared for by the British state in recognition of their military service. It is a Roman ideal, still practiced 2,000 years later. But beneath Rome's layer of civilization, her success depended on a ferocity in war unmatched in the ancient world.
The Roman army in action was a ruthless and savage organization. Even the Romans themselves recognized that. Roman writers describe the frightful excesses that these disciplined legionaries could commit against beaten enemies and against rebels to authority.
Polybius described how Scipio Africanus, after storming New Carthage,
directed his soldiers according to the Roman custom against the people in the city, telling them to kill everyone they met and to spare no one. The purpose of this custom is to strike terror. One can see in cities captured by the Romans not only human beings who have been slaughtered, but even dogs sliced in two, and the limbs of other animals cut off.
If one resisted the Romans too long in a siege, one would expect the worst. The city would have been vandalized, pillaged, looted, and the males would have been slaughtered and the women and children would have been sold into slavery.
the Romans were a great siege army. They used a variety of siege engines designed and built with typical Roman ingenuity. When there was no time to build trenches to protect themselves from enemy missiles, Roman soldiers would use their shields to form a protective roof over their heads. They called it a testudo, a tortoise, a formation still used by riot police today. In a long siege, the Romans' trump card was their perseverance. At one city, hearing the inhabitants had food for 10 years, the Roman commander calmly announced, "Then we'll take it in the 11th." The city surrendered at once.
If one looks at the Roman military, it is seen that the empire came into their hands as a result of their valor, not as a gift of fortune. For they do not wait for the outbreak of war to practice with weapons, nor do they sit idle in peace, mobilizing themselves only in time of need. Instead, they seem to have been born with weapons in their hands. Do they break from training or wait for emergencies to arise? One would not be incorrect in saying their maneuvers are like bloodless battles, and their battles, bloody maneuvers.
In siege and in battle, Rome was invincible. From the wilds of Britain to the plains of Asia Minor, no one dared stand in her way. In the first years after the birth of Christ, Rome's power seemed unstoppable. Augustus Caesar was the most powerful man in the world. He'd fought his way to power in a bloody civil war. Augustus Caesar ruled an empire that stretched all the way from the deserts of North Africa to the northern forests of Germany. At this frontier in 9 AD, the Roman general Varus led his 17th, 18th, and 19th legions against the greatest threat the empire had ever faced. Varus was governor-general of the northern territories and commander-in-chief of an army of 20,000 men. His mission was to lead those 3 legions and their camp followers, 10,000 women and children, to their winter quarters. Varus's guide was Arminius, chief of the Cherusci tribe. Arminius was a trusted ally, having fought many battles for the Romans. The journey took the Romans through the vast Teutoburg forest. It had been raining for days. The ground was sodden and muddy, but Varus was so confident of his handling of the Germans, he allowed his troops to straggle out in a thin, defenseless line, with no means of command or communication.
The German leaders who had accompanied Varus when he set out, one by one made excuses and left him. This was to enable them to prepare their combined forces. Then they took command of their troops who were already waiting in readiness in the forest. At the most impenetrable part of the forest, they fell upon Varus.
Deep in the forest, the Germans had built earth walls and ditches that trapped the fleeing Romans like wild animals. The barbarians picked off their victims. At the end of the first day's fighting, the legions were badly mauled. But these were experienced troops. They wouldn't give in easily.
The next day, they marched in somewhat better order and even broke into open country.
But soon the Romans' route forced them back into the forest. By now, the army was strung out even further as slower groups fell way behind the head of the column. Varus knew another onslaught could come at any time. He forced a way through the densest thickets, where the enemy was familiar with every inch of the ground. By afternoon, his 3 legions were stretched out like a giant snake. Again, the Germans fell upon the legions.
They neither draw their bows or hurl their javelins to any effect, or even make much use of their shields, which were completely sodden with rain. Their opponents, on the other hand, were lightly armed, and so could approach or retire without difficulty.
In the chaos, the Germans captured the Roman imperial standard. It was the greatest shame that could befall a legion. What was left of the column marched on, unaware of the fate of those ahead.
They were few in number, and had many non-combatants from the baggage train with them. They managed to slip past the enemy on 2 or 3 occasions, but their presence was discovered. This was because the women and children, who were both frightened and exhausted, and troubled too by the darkness and the cold, kept calling to the soldiers to come back.
Of 20,000 legionaries and a baggage train of 10,000 men, women, and children, fewer than 2,000 escaped the 3-day massacre. In a dark, dense forest in Germany, Rome discovered the limits of its power. 6 years after the devastating massacre of 3 Roman legions in the Teutoburg forest, a detachment of Roman soldiers found the remains of their fallen comrades. The Roman historian Tacitus described the scene.
Varus's camp, with its wide circumference and the measurements of its central space, clearly indicated the handiwork of 3 legions. Further on, the partially fallen rampart and the shallow ditch suggested that it was a shattered remnant of the army that had taken up a position there. In the center of the field were the whitening bones of men, as they had fled or stood their ground, strewn everywhere, all piled in heaps. Nearby lay fragments of weapons and limbs of horses, and also human heads prominently nailed to trunks of trees. In the adjacent groves were the barbarous altars on which they had burned tribunes and first-rank centurions. Some survivors of the disaster who had escaped from the battle or from captivity described how this was the spot where the officers fell, how yonder the eagles were captured, where Varus was pierced by his first wound, where too, by the stroke of his own ill-starred hand, he killed himself.
As the stunned Romans surveyed the remains, they realized how one-sided the fight had been. It was a massacre. But even before the remains were discovered, news of the massacre had shaken Rome to the core.
Varus' defeat nearly wrecked the empire, since 3 legions with their general and all their officers and auxiliary forces were massacred. When the news reached Rome, the Emperor Augustus ordered patrols of the city at night to prevent any rising or riots. Indeed, it is said that he took the disaster so deeply to heart that he left his hair and beard untrimmed for months. He would often beat his head on a door shouting, "Quinctilius Varus, give me back my legions," and always kept the anniversary of the massacre as a day of deep mourning.
After Teutoburg, there would never be a 17th, 18th, or 19th Legion in the Roman army. The numbers and the failure they represented were banished from memory.
The Roman soldiers, 6 years after the disaster, in grief and anger, began to bury the bones of the 3 legions. Not a soldier knowing whether he was interring the relics of a relative or a stranger, but looking on all as kinsfolk, and of their own blood, while their wrath rose higher than ever against the foe.
After this shattering defeat, Rome took stock of her empire. She began to question her expansionist policy. The Emperor Augustus abandoned his plans for the conquest of Germany. The lands beyond the Rhine and Danube rivers were left to the barbarians. The effect of this single defeat was to halt the advance of the world's mightiest army for almost 40 years. When the legions marched again, it would be to the west, to the distant island of Britain. After defeat at the hands of barbarians, the Roman Emperor Augustus advised his successors not to extend the empire. Within 5 years, Augustus was dead, a broken man. But 30 years later, a new ambitious emperor, Claudius, yearned for glory and new conquests. In 43 AD, he looked to Britain. This was not the Britain the world knows today. It was a wild and dangerous place, covered for the most part in dense, impenetrable forest. Iron Age tribes hunted bears and wild boar. There were constant battles over territory. It was to this isolated island that Claudius sent 4 legions of the Roman army. They achieved the first successful amphibious assault on Britain. New towns and new cities were built, including Londinium, known today as London. Britain became a province of Rome. Despite this successful conquest of Britain, the Romans never forgot the Teutoburg massacre. They finally drew a limit to their advance. Across Europe, they created a defensive line. It formed a continuous 1,500-mile barrier between what was Rome and what was not, linking the rivers Rhine and Danube with a palisade, a strong spiked fence. In Britain, the Emperor Hadrian built a wall at the northern frontier. Hadrian's wall extended from the Irish Sea, where it was made of earth and timber, across 73 miles to Britain's eastern coast. The last 45 miles were stone. Every mile there was a mile castle, and every few miles a fort. Alongside the wall, from end to end, was a defensive ditch and a supply road, typically Roman and straight.
Do
vast empire had been conquered and unified by the first great emperor, Qin. The Great Wall of China, started in 200 BC, was extended and fortified until it reached all the way from the Gobi Desert to the Yellow Sea, 4,000 miles to the east. Unlike Roman walls, this Great Wall was not built to keep people out, but to regulate the flow of people. Merchants and traders flowed in and out of China along the new Silk Road. Up and down this route came spices, livestock, and of course, silk. And the Chinese were receptive to ideas that came from beyond their wall. But they also had a healthy fear of their immediate neighbors to the north. Although they couldn't know it, they shared this same fear with the people of Rome. The Chinese called their northern neighbors the Xiongnu. The Romans and the rest of Europe would call them the Hun. China and Rome were the twin lights of civilization. The steppe where the godless nomads roamed was the dark abyss between. This vast green expanse between two empires was the birthplace of men who would set out to destroy civilization through war. Genghis Khan, Tamerlane, and Attila the Hun, the scourge of God. These people were everything the builders of empire were not. They had no cities. As nomads, they built nothing more than flimsy tents. They had little in the way of private property. They consumed everything in their path, including, the Romans and Chinese believed, human beings. The Romans confronted the Hun and their general Attila near a town called Chalons in France. The battle in 451 AD was a narrow victory for the Romans and a momentous victory for the European people. But it wasn't a victory from which Rome could take comfort. For 600 years, Rome's legions had taught the world how to fight. Now they would be taught a lesson.